Hello, everyone. Thank you so much today for joining us for the Untangle Tech Talk series. Today, we'll be showcasing one of our newly updated NG Firewall applications, our Intrusion Prevention app. My name is Shannon Bonfiglio, and I'll be your host today. I'm part of the marketing team here, and I have with us Dirk Morris, who is our Chief Product Officer, and he's going to be taking us through this application and all the new updates that have happened since our 14.1 release. Just a few housekeeping rules before we get started. Please be sure you're selecting the correct audio preference. On the right-hand side, you'll see you can use your telephone. If you do decide to use the telephone, you will need to use the access code provided. If not, you can use your mic and speakers on your computer. You will need to make sure you have a good, strong internet connection in order to use your computer speakers. And as always, we have a few members on hand to help answer questions. You see on the right-hand side, there's a questions box. Please, at any time during the webinar, submit those questions and we'll be happy to answer those. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to rewatch or revisit or share this webinar with anyone afterwards. It'll be posted on the Untangle YouTube channel within 24 hours after this has ended. And just a reminder, this is a Tech Talk webinar. We are going to get into very technical aspects of the application and networking. So if you are unfamiliar with Untangle or networking solutions, this may not be the right webinar for you. We do have higher level webinars, our 101s that cover more general topics, but this Tech Talk will get pretty nitty gritty with the Intrusion Prevention app. And I think that's it. If we don't get to your question or if you have any additional questions, please email us support@untangle.com or sales@untangle.com. And with that, I'll pass it over to Dirk.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks everybody for joining us. Eager to dig into a lot of the new intrusion prevention. As many may know, we did redo intrusion prevention. So there's a brand new implementation as of 14.1, which is the current latest version of Untangle. So if you've already got Untangle installed, like Shannon said, we're not going to go through the basics of Untangle, but intrusion prevention should be one of your latest apps. And if you're on 14.1, you have the newest intrusion prevention already. So, and I will switch back and forth between the slide deck and actually showing you the product. Nobody wants to look at slides, so I'll be showing you some of the intrusion prevention things that you can do. But really quick, before we jump into that, let me just explain what intrusion prevention is, just in case you don't already know. Intrusion prevention, which is a general term used to a security technique that used to secure networks, which essentially is a huge set of signatures that look for suspicious or malicious, or just in some cases, very common things and alert the administrator that something is going on. The way this typically works is, let's say a 0-day exploit comes out that says, I can write something of an incorrect size to this service and get it to do something malicious. Usually when that happens in the real world, it takes a while for the vendors to update software, and then it takes even longer for users to update their software. And in the meantime, what happens is intrusion prevention will roll out a signature saying, if you see this network traffic, that is malicious. So there's a huge set of signatures, and I'll show you some in a minute, that just detect these commonly malicious things. Now, many of them are ancient from eras past, but new ones are updated very frequently. So what's happening in the background is all the time intrusion prevention is downloading the newest signatures and running them on your network. So it's kind of like a leaky dam. Security is a leaky dam, and intrusion prevention is the model we're just going to go release signatures to plug the holes in the dam, which really helps secure things when you have a gap between the time that the exploit is discovered and the software is updated. You have the proper defense in place, so to speak. So that's really what intrusion prevention is. It's a running of tons of signatures on network traffic to look for malicious activity at its core. So it's just some of the fundamentals. Signatures are the huge set of, they're kind of like antivirus signatures. They look for common strings, and each one of them is written a little bit differently. And I'll show some of these. And these come from signature providers. Untangle does not write these. So in our case, let me log into a system real quick. We get our signatures from emerging threats. There are several signature providers out there. We've tested a lot of them. And we're currently the most impressed with emerging threats. So again, to get to your intrusion prevention, click on apps and click on Intrusion Prevention. And I'll go through all these tabs later. I'm just going to skip to the Signatures tab first. And here you'll see all the signatures that we get from emerging threats. So you can click on any of these. They're by default grouped by what's called class type. There's all sorts of different types and categories and protocols of each signature. And you can look at each one of these signatures. If you mouse over it, you'll actually see the full signature, which is a real mouthful, and some of the information about it. This is saying, hey, if you've got this packet with a legal flag set, then that's suspicious. In reality, that's probably not going to, this signature from 2010, that's probably not going to be a real problem on your network, but you know, it might be interesting. So all these hundreds and hundreds and, well, 32,000 something signatures currently come from emerging threats, and they all come with a recommended action. Over here in the recommended action column, you'll see what emerging threats recommends to do if this rule matches network traffic. So if this is seen, it says, I think you should log this. And this one's actually disabled entirely. So they make some determination when they write these rules, say, here's what we recommend. So that's what you get from upstream, and that's continuously coming down to your intrusion prevention. Untangle, the new intrusion prevention, introduced this concept of rules, and rules are what we're going to use. So rules are something that you craft, and basically they determine which signatures are enabled and disabled and what action they will take if they're enabled. So your rule set is where you're going to do most of your work to determine what configuration your signatures ultimately have on your running setup. So previously we just had a big list of signatures. You go in and check them on and off. That was very difficult for a lot of reasons. One, the settings are huge, so it's very hard to manage lots of different servers, especially when you're cloud managing them. But two, weird things happen during updates. If they change a signature, should you turn it on or off? If they delete a signature and you've changed the setting, should you remove it? There were all sorts of corner cases. And so it was a very difficult and confusing thing for users to go in here and change the settings on signatures and then have it overridden by updates upstream. So we've separated these two concepts, signatures and rules. And rules, basically, this rule set, each signature is evaluated against this rule set one at a time. The rules are run in order, just like all rules on Untangle. So unlike most rules, it's not running on sessions, it's running on signatures. And the rules will determine if it's turned on or not and the action that's taken. This is the actually default rule set that you'll get when you do a fresh install. And what this says is, so first of all, there's a couple of rules that aren't enabled. So let me just ignore those for now. And then let's look at these rules. What these rules say is if your system memory is greater than 1 gig and the class type is of these types, I want to use the recommended action. And then there's another rule saying if you've got more than 1.5 gig and 2 gig. So what these three rules basically do is they say for each signature, I'm going to run through it and say if my memory is greater than 1 gig, on this machine it is, it actually is greater than all these. It's going to basically, the net result is all these class types are going to take the recommended action. So if I look down here, the effect of these three rules alone is that there's going to be 19,000 signatures set to log, and there's going to be 7,000, roughly 8,000 not enabled at all. And that's the result from these three rules. The reason we do this is because Intrusion Prevention is a very hungry app. That's the reason we have this system memory thing that basically says don't enable these signatures unless you have more memory. So most people will have more than this. So the effect of these is we take the recommended action of all these class types by default from emerging threats. And over here, if I switch back to signatures, let me just look at attempted admin and scroll down. So this, let's take a look at this example here. I don't know what the signature does, but the recommended action was to log for emerging threats. And based on our rule set, we're going to take the actual log rule action. And if you look down, you'll see a lot of this where we actually take the recommended action because that's what our rule set says to do. In all these cases, it's going to take the recommended action. So let me just read over rules, or sorry, the questions real quick. If you have questions, or if I didn't cover something very well, please type your questions into the question box so I can make sure I'm on point and cover all your questions. So let me just look at a rule real quick. Let's say we're just going to make a test rule. We're going to make something up. Rules have, like all rules in Untangle, all sorts of different conditions, except these conditions match on the signatures instead of sessions. So let's say I wanted to say message equals something. Let me say contains WordPress. Let's say I have a WordPress server. So I'm really worried about WordPress exploits, and I want to actually take a different action. If a WordPress is in the message of the signature, I want to enable block if it's recommended to be on. That's what this rule would do. And it also gives me a hint, by the way, this would affect 234 signatures. Let me explain what these different actions do. We've seen recommended already. Basically what recommended means is you take the action that's recommended by emerging threats, by our upstream rule set, our signature set. Enable log means you enable log on the rule. And that means no matter what the recommendation from upstream was, you're going to enable log on this signature. Enable block is very similar. It means no matter what the recommendation was, you're going to enable block on this signature. So if I wanted to enable all my WordPress signatures to block, which by the way, you probably want to read your signatures before doing this, you could do that. A very common action is enable block if recommended is enabled. So basically what this means is I only want to enable block on that rule if that rule was already suggested by emerging threats. So this is a very common thing to do. If you're wanting to enable block on rules, which we'll get into whether I'd recommend that or not. If you want to do that, this is a very common action. And then there's another way to just say, I just want to disable this rule. So this would be a very common action if you have a problematic rule that's firing too much, you're tired of hearing about it, you don't care about it, you know it's a false positive, it's causing problems. You could put a rule at the top of your signature set here that disables this rule. So let me say I wanted to enable log on WordPress. So our test rule is now at the bottom. Like all rules, they're run in order. So essentially what you want to do is drag it up here. So my test rule is now at the top. Let me just for demonstration purposes say I want to enable block. I'm just going to save that. So basically we're going to turn on all signatures that include the word WordPress in the message. And here, down here, you can see why this is saving and reloading the signatures and restarting the daemon and all that. This actually ended up turning on 212 block rules. So 212 signatures are now set to block that were obviously not before. And this is a basically summary of your entire signatures or your entire rule set on the signatures. And saving, by the way, does take a little bit of time for a couple reasons. It's going to restart the IPS engine here. And also it has to reload the entire signature set, which is a huge signature set from the back end, and reload it into the UI so that you have the new recommended and rule actions over here. So saving these can take a little bit of time, unlike say web filter or something like that. So let me switch back and say, let's use this filter up at the top. So let's say we wanted to look through signatures. What I did a second ago was I just looked for things that said WordPress in the message. So you can use this filter to view what signatures match that. So here you can see, and here you can literally see the word WordPress in all these messages. And here you say recommended action was log. Well, remember I just added that rule that said I wanted to block anything that was recommended to be enabled. So as you can see, all these are now set to block. So that's how you would craft a custom rule. Let's say we wanted to do something different in MS SQL. Let me just search for not SQLi, MS SQL. Let's say I'm running a database server and I'm really concerned about securing it, and maybe it hasn't been updated in a while. So I'm looking through these. A shellcode exploit that looks kind of serious. It's from 2010, so I would have to have not updated for a while, but let's just say I'm running a really old MS SQL server. And I want to enable these rules to block. Instead of going back over here and creating a custom rule like I just did, you can actually just create a rule straight here from this filter. So say create rule, it's going to fill this in for me automatically. I can select the action I want, click done. Again, rules are evaluated in order, so I want to remove this rule to the top or wherever I want it to be. If you've got disabled rules, you probably want it to be below that. You have to think about the order of your rules, just like firewall rules, to make sure you get the net effect that you want. So then I would hit save. And again, this is going to take a little bit while because what's going on in the background is it's saving all those signatures, reevaluating all the rules and all the signatures, restarting the entire IPS engine, and then it has to reload the signatures when it's done with that. And I'm actually logged in remotely. So it has to re-download the signature. So this will take a little bit of a second. While that's going, I'm actually going to really quickly look over any questions. For those, there's a couple questions about resolution and so on. You can use a zoom function in your go-to webinar, go-to meeting thing to zoom in. I have a big screen, so unfortunately, when you're viewing on a smaller screen, the resolution might look really bad. There's a couple questions about I don't see signatures or rules. If you don't see the signatures tab, you're probably not on the latest version. Let me show quickly how to go about and check that. When you click config about, you should see 14.1. If you don't see 14.1, you're not on the latest version. You won't have this version of IPS. All right, so let me switch back and make sure I'm hitting all the points. Let me show you quickly how to create custom signatures. I've shown you how to do filters. So you can always create custom signatures. Again, this is for really advanced users. So if you have a signature that you want to craft, you can do that still. Or if you've downloaded one off the internet or something like that, you still can go here and you can set the recommended action. This is your own signature, so your recommended action will be whatever you want it to be. Again, this is still going to get affected by the rules later, but you can set the recommended action, unlike rules that come from emerging threats. So that's how you would go about creating a custom signature, and you can do that as always. The interesting thing about the new IPS is the signatures themselves, all this useless is not stored in the settings. Only things stored in the settings are the rules and your custom signatures. The effect of that is the settings are actually quite small. So your backups, you probably notice on 14.1 are much smaller than they used to be, because in the reality of all the settings on Untangle, including all the apps, IPS is by far the biggest settings because it stored signatures in the settings, unlike, say, Virus Blocker, which does not store the antivirus signatures in the settings, or Spam Blocker, which doesn't store the anti-spam signatures in the settings. IPS did. So it was very big, but now it's very, very small because all you're storing is rules and custom signatures. So rules, I think I already covered most of this, but I will obviously reemphasize it. Rules require very careful configuration. IPS, and I'll get into this a little now, I guess. IPS is a very useful tool in security. However, unlike a lot of the tools, a lot of the security technologies in Untangle, it does require a lot more maintenance than most. So it's not a very set it and forget it friendly security technology. To really get the most out of IPS, if you're going to start blocking stuff, you're really going to have to spend some time tuning your rule set. The other thing to be very careful of, if you go in here and you turn on block for a lot of rules, like an entire category or something, and you just say, well, this sounds bad, I want to block all worms. This could be very dangerous because essentially you're turning on a whole bunch of rules which were not recommended from upstream that may have false positives. So what you do is if you enable block on a lot of rules, you may have problems on your network. You need to be aware that if you run across problems, you can come in here, go to status and turn off your IPS to make sure it's not the problem, or turn off your rules as part of the troubleshooting process. That's a new thing that you probably didn't have to deal with before unless you were enabling block on a lot of rules. The only thing that's really changed is it's now very easy to enable block on a lot of rules, whereas before it was a little more work. Let me read the questions real quick. Are there no signatures recommended to block? It looks like they're all either logged or disabled. Correct. Emerging threats or VRT, actually any upstream signature provider does not recommend any rules to be blocked by default. Either does Untangle. We actually just pass through the recommendation with the exception of these, which we enable. We say, depending on your memory, we'd recommend using the recommended action for these. It is up to you what your ultimate configuration of your signatures is. So you can disregard our recommendation or emerging threats or VRT or whatever, and use the rules to your desired configuration. Just reading the questions real quick. I covered most of the actions. Again, recommended, just the recommended. I should talk a little bit about resource intensive nature of IPS. IPS is a very resource intensive application. Probably one of the most that we have, except maybe for SSL inspector. If you're doing a lot of SSL inspection, it's very hard on the CPU. IPS can be very heavyweight, especially on smaller boxes. I'll talk a little bit about switching to Surcata a little bit later, which we did underneath the covers. For those of you techies who followed the whole Surcata and Snort, we did switch to Surcata, which is a different engine. But in general, IPS can be very intensive, especially on memory usage. So we did actually add this new graph. This system has 16 gigs of memory. So this graph is not particularly exciting because the net on this server is that it's only using 2% of IPS specifically is using 2% of this server's memory because it has 16 gigs. If you only have 2 gigs, you're going to see a much different graph. But we add this graph to allow you to see what percentage of the memory IPS, the engine itself, is using. So if you see, 50%, that means you're spending 50% of your memory on IPS specifically. The good news is that in the real world, we now have a lot of real world data. The new engine, Suricata, is contrary to popular belief, more memory efficient than the old one, Snort. So we're seeing on general only 300 megs of memory for most rule sets of memory usage, which is stellar compared to the old one, which could be 600 to a gig of memory, depending on your rules. Other really nice things here is you can just see how much memory the engine's using in bytes, some general statistics about your signatures, how many signatures you currently have, when it was last updated, when it was last checked, and then the current configuration based on your rule set. How many are logging, how many are blocking, and how many are disabled. One of the nice things with this model that I should touch on, if they change the recommendation upstream, that obviously trickles down and changes the recommended value. And whether or not you use the recommended values depends on your actions. So that's a nice thing, is they change the recommendation to say, I'm going from recommending this to be logged to no longer enabled at all, or vice versa. You now can see that action directly. You don't have to go into signatures and change anything. Why is everything recommended to log and not blocked? It's a very frequent question. You would have to ask emerging threats why they recommend everything to log and not block, but I will give you the quick answer. IPS is not a set it and forget it technology, like I said. If you enable block on a lot of things, which I'll go through the reports in a few minutes, you'll see a lot of stuff gets flagged. If I turned on block for everything that got flagged, you would get a lot of blocks and you would have a lot of problems on your network. And that's not the experience that signature providers want people to have. And in order to get a net positive effect out of it, it requires work. So they're not going to recommend a configuration that's going to be a net negative effect right out of the gate. Yes, it may secure your network a little bit better, but it's going to cause so many problems that it doesn't matter. In other words, they wouldn't recommend you just unplug your Ethernet cable from the internet, even though it's more secure, because the downsides of that are more severe than the treatment. So the effect is nobody recommends block because of all the issues it has. But you can choose to say, I disregard that and I block whatever I want. And that will absolutely work as long as you're willing to invest the time to tune your rules. And again, I'll go into the report so we can see how much stuff gets blocked. But real quick, I wanted to cover variables. Variables you probably don't need to tune at all. Variables are a lot of these signatures, if you go in and look at how the signature are written, a lot of them use what are called variables. Let me see if I can find one. Well, this one uses external net to home net. So I'm looking for, this specific signature. It looks like something that contains XYZ of content this. But I'm only looking for that from a packet that's coming from an external net on HTTPS ports to my internal net. These variables are defined here. For the most part, home net and external net are, if you use the value default, what that means is it's going to look at your network configuration and calculate based on your subnets and your network configuration what is considered to be home net and what is considered to be external. External is basically considered to be not home, and home net just goes and looks at all your subnets saying, I see 192.168.1.x, so I'm putting that in the home net. So for the most part, and then all these other ones say, well, I'm just going to define my HTTP servers to be home net. You could technically restrict that to say, well, I know specifically my HTTP servers are this. Very rarely do you need to do that. And then there's a couple of things that you say, well, I want HTTP ports to be considered 80. But I could, if I run HTTP port on 8080, I could add that here. So very rarely do you need to change any of this stuff, but it is there if you do need to change it. Just reading through the questions really quick, sorry. So the way variables work is they're just substituted in the value. But keep in mind, literally the value is not going to be default. When we're writing the rules, the signatures, sorry, we're going to substitute default with your configuration. The rest of them are just expanded in place. All right, moving right along. Let me switch back to the deck to make sure I'm covering everything. Let me show a little bit about reports. So let's do some looking at reports. So again, this is just this specific server. You can get the reports, all reports here. You can click on View Reports here, which will take you right to the IPS reports. And like all reports at Untangle, it's got a whole bunch of different pre-built reports. You can create custom ones. So let me just click on the summary real quick, which basically just says detected 12,000 attacks. Attacks doesn't mean literally attacks in this case. It just means it matched whatever the action was, which we obviously don't know without looking at the rules. But I can click here from general statistics. Here you can see on any given time how many rules were detected, how many rules were logged, and how many rules were blocked. So you can zoom in here and look at all sorts of different ones. Let me switch back. Or I can look at logged and blocked separately. And then I can get all sorts of statistics about what are my top signatures that were logged. I can look at these, and again, you can always view data. So if I was interested in tuning my rule set, I could probably come in here and say, let me look at these and see what I think. Ping. Okay, that's not very interesting. Somebody pinged my server. Again, this is the type of rules that are in IPS. You have to be aware that there are many rules in there that are very mundane things. Somebody tried to log in to a web server. That doesn't necessarily mean it's malicious. That just means it happened. So what you consider to be important to you, you need to come in here and look at. So let me say, let's pick something more interesting, another ping. That's not very interesting. Suspicious inbound port. Okay, that means somebody tried to connect to port 41433, which by the way, I don't forward. We're running NAT, so that goes nowhere. IPS is still going to tell you about that. So was this a risk? No, because I actually don't have an MS SQL server. I don't have port 1433 forwarded, and I don't have it allowed anyway. So I'm not particularly concerned about this, but IPS scans before all that happens. So you're going to see this kind of stuff, and that's totally fine. You can just ignore it and say, well, I don't have port 1433 open, so this is not particularly interesting. So let me look down here and say, well, let's look at this. There's a lot of signatures you see poor reputation IP. So this is kind of one of those middle cases where you could say, Emerging threats maintains a bunch of signatures that basically says these IPs have behaved poorly. We don't have a ton of information about what they did exactly at this point, but they recommend that this has a poor reputation, and they're letting you know this IP tried to contact your network. Now, in this case, we don't actually have any public servers on site, so we're not port forwarding a bunch of stuff. So I'm not really concerned about this network because they can't get into the network. There's no public services available. But let's assume that I had a bunch of web servers and I didn't want these people to get access to my web server. So for the sake of exercise, let me just, what we could do is go back and craft a rule that says we want to turn on all those. Or we could go here and let me see. So here's an example of this guy, source address, some IP, tried to connect to TCP port 555. Again, that's not port forwarded, so this is going to go nowhere, but it's just letting me know that this happened. Let's say I wanted to block this specific signature. There's now an action over here that you can go through this list and say, I want to block this specific signature. And you can click this, and what it's actually going to do is add a rule. Now, again, this is going to take some time because it actually adds it to your rule set and reloads all the signatures. So if you want a quick way to add a rule that blocks that specific signature, you can click this block icon over here, and it will add the rules. Or sorry, add a rule that enables that signature. So I'm gonna let that run. Actually, I'll open another window so we can switch back and forth while that's going. Okay, so that one finished. Let me just go and show the effect of clicking on that icon. So if I go to rules, you'll see at the top, event block. This is just a description that it created on my behalf when I clicked that button. And what it did was say, enable this specific signature, this group identifier 1, enable block. So enable block on that specific rule. Let me just say that let's look at if we wanted to, let me look at the data view again. And you could always, as always, if you have tons of data, you can export it and look at yourself. Poor reputation. So let's say we wanted to go in here and say poor reputation. They got 100 of these rules. And look, each one has a list of IPs saying this guy is suspicious. Let's say I want to create a rule for that. And I want to enable block if recommended enabled. And then I need to move this to the top because I want those rules enabled, even if they were recommended here. So click save there. And again, that's going to take a while. It's going to restart the whole unit. But that's how we go about enabling all those poor reputation signatures. So you can use the different reports to view and slice and dice the data and create your own reports. And you can also add conditions to say, I want to look at attacks to a specific server and things like that. You can view one at a time. Just go down here and look at all these to see what you're seeing. And again, if you do this as an exercise on your own, you'll see a lot of stuff that's probably not very interesting. So maybe you want to go in and disable this stuff. This was probably enabled by one of our rules, and now we've changed this one. So this was not blocked because it was just set to log, so blocked equals false. But now we've changed the signature to be blocking, so this will be blocked in the future. So you can go through here and do your own exercise, evaluate what's happening on your network, and tune your rule set as needed. Your rule set, basically, you can think of it as your IPS philosophy. It encompasses your IPS philosophy. Here's what you want to be enabled or not enabled, and here's what you want the settings to be. And the nice thing is you can export these, you can share these, you can push them between servers using Command Center. So if you have lots of different boxes out there, you can now capture your IPS philosophy here and push it out to all your different servers. So you're making your life much easier by not having to maintain them all over the place. A couple of questions about geo-IP blocking. That's in firewall. I would not do that in IPS. It's not really, it doesn't really have a geolocation thing. So if you just want to block by country, you can do that in firewall. I'm sorry, just reading the questions real quick. Continuing on, let me make sure. I showed creating rules and then creating summaries and then conditions as well. So I believe that's it. Let me just go really quick and look through any other questions. For some reason, a lot of questions about adding GeoIP, like if I wanted to block connections from some country or to some certain country, you would do that in firewall, which is firewall rules. So you go here and say, server, I want to block country, to, I don't know, Angola. I don't want people talking to Angola. I don't want any clients on my network to be talking to Angola. I would do that. But that has nothing to do with IPS specifically. Another thing to keep in mind with respect to the other apps is IPS scans things. It's not per policy, it's global. And that's the reason is it's not layer 7. It's actually picking up layer 3 packets and scanning them. It also scans things absolutely first. So you may have all sorts of stuff that's configured. I'm going to block things to Angola. Well, IPS may still see attacks, or let's say we added a firewall rule saying I'm blocking things from China. IPS is still going to see attacks from China. The reason is it's scanning the packets on the very outside. So even though you don't have any port forwards and NAT's going to basically block all inbound connections, and you have firewall rules to set up to block this stuff, and web filter rules and virus blocker and all these other technologies, IPS is still going to see these things because it's scanning them. So that's why you need to go through these rules saying, well, I don't really care. Like I didn't care about MS SQL attacks because I don't have port 1433 open on my network. IPS is still going to tell you that information. You could do it the other way. We did in the past actually have it scan last, but as a result, it detected almost nothing because not much is getting through, and people didn't like that. So people wanted to see, well, I want to know when somebody's port scanning my network, even though they're not getting any information that's being blocked, I want to know about it. So IPS runs on the outside, so just keep that in mind when you're seeing things, that it's reporting a lot of things, and a lot of it's just noise. That is the reality. A lot of this is just, it's happening. Is it something that deems investment of time on your part? Not necessarily. And that's totally fine. That's just the nature of the beast. And then if you have any more questions and answers, please type them in now. Just going to review a couple frequently asked questions. What is IPS based on? So I actually switched to Suricata in the latest release. So the reason we did that is a couple things. Is in general, we found it to be a little bit better in some aspects. Performance, it's highly threaded. So for highly multi-core systems, Suricata performs a little bit better. And in some ways, using it is a little bit easier as an engineer than Snort. The other positive thing, which wasn't really the motivation, but it's been nice, is that the memory usage tends to be a little bit smaller on your standard type configurations. And obviously, a lot of the memory usage depends on your configuration. So it could be larger in some scenarios, but in general, in the real world, we've seen that most scenarios it uses less memory. So you can read about Suricata here. That's a really nice project. And again, the signature set, which is separate from the project that creates the engine, is emerging threats. A lot of the rules, why is there no reference information for specific rules? Sorry, signatures, I should say. The signatures have, a lot of them have links where you can go and read about the individual signatures. Sorry, just reading the questions really quick. We're not hosting any services. Can IPS pretty much be used to set it and forget it other than reviewing the logs? Absolutely. What I would recommend is if you want to run IPS, install it, use the recommended values, the recommended rule set. If you really want to be aggressive and you know what you're doing and willing to spend the time, you can turn on here and turn on what's called the critical rules, which I would take with a grain of salt. So there's a couple class types which emerging threats considers to be critical in nature. So you could turn those on. But really the default rules of this, let me get rid of all these rules. This default rule set is a completely acceptable thing. It's actually really going to be a common and good thing to run. The net effect of it is you will get a lot of noise about port scans and so on. So if you don't care about that, you don't need to read. But this will be a very common configuration, especially if you don't have a lot of externally visible services. There's not really a lot for you to worry about with respect to IPS because you're not having things that you need to patch and stay on top of. So hopefully that answered that question. Somebody's saying a couple of questions about detecting port scans. I don't think they were on by default. So there's some of these that weren't enabled. If you search for Nmap, you can see them. We used to enable these, and actually we may change it back to enable these because people really want to see them, even though they're not necessarily an attack. I think it's Nmap. So you can go in here and enable these. They're not all on by default. As you can see, most of them are turned off. But they use basically kind of a load metric to say you're trying to connect to a lot of ports. I think this looks like a port scan, and then it will log. So you can go in here and turn those on if you want to see that type of information. Which, by the way, if you do that, you will see a lot of it. You know, the nature of being connected to the internet is you're, quote, under attack all the time. You're not really under attack. You're just, you know, there's people pinging your network. There's people port scanning your network all the time. That's completely normal. And it's not necessarily a threat in the sense that not something you need to worry about. Untangle has many technologies that's going to block it behind it, as well as just the nature of firewalls. Unless you port forward it specifically, it's not going to go anywhere. But IPS will detect and report on all that activity. So just be aware of that. Does IDS, there's a question about how IPS and IDS works with the VPN tunnels. It depends on your VPN, sadly. IPsec, it's not gonna be able to see inside those packets. OpenVPN, it will, because OpenVPN is a separate interface, so it sees them after they come out of that interface. So it scans things kind of coming and going out of the tunnel. So if you're using Tunnel VPN, or if you're using OpenVPN to connect to other networks, it will still scan that traffic. IPsec works a little bit differently. Well, and again, completely differently if you're in tunnel versus transport mode. So IPS, I would just say, generally speaking, no. All the tunnel-based, OpenVPN-based protocols, yes. It will scan the clear text version as they come out of the tunnel. And then I'll address this one last time. Why aren't most of the rules set to block by default? That's just not a recommendation, to be frank. IPS is a double-edged sword, and it's easy to cut your own hands off with it. Can it be an effective security technology? Absolutely, yes. Is it something that most Untangle users, which Untangle's gauged at people who just want their network to be safe and work, and not spend all day tinkering with rules and so on, and do not have staff dedicated to do that? It's not a very Untangle-friendly technology in that sense. It's really found its place mostly in enterprise, where you have staff that can sit there and obsess about all these little log incidents in the rules and tune the rule set and spend all day doing this stuff. And it's not something that we can just recommend with a broad brush saying this will work for your network. It absolutely does not work like that. So the recommendation from Emerging Threats and VRT and us as well is, you know, here's the default rules. You can choose to tune that beyond that, but that is a pretty reasonable thing to do on their behalf, in my opinion, and that's why they do it. And then real quick on the policy thing, like I said, IPS does not run at layer 7, so it's global. So keep that in mind that you can't then say, I want to say run this signature for this set of users or groups or policy or time of day. IPS doesn't work like that. It's a different technology. It runs at layer 7, it runs packets. And again, keep in mind that it will scan stuff that's ultimately certainly going to be blocked anyway. So that's not necessarily a concern just because you see it in your reports. And then real quick, let me just look over any, there's a question about SSL inspection. SSL inspection works at layer 7, unfortunately. So even though you're doing SSL inspection, the IPS engine can't see those packets because it's not working at layer 7. So the way SSL inspection works is it unpacks the stream. The stream goes through all the other apps like web filter and virus blocker, and it gets scrubbed clean, and then it gets put back on the network. IPS engine actually listens to the network, so it's not going to see inside SSL inspection. And reading the other questions, got a lot of questions pouring them in. Sorry, I just want to make sure I answer all the topics.
Yeah, we're getting close to time, so I don't know if there's any other questions, Dirk, you want to answer.
No, I think it's mainly kind of repeat questions about what rules should I set to block? How would I go about setting up block? Essentially, I think you need to apply, our recommendation is the default rules. Let me be clear on that. Beyond that, I think it's up to you. I hear clearly that some people would love for us to set some rules that we think are reasonable to block. We have set the rules that we think are reasonable to block. That is none of them. So you can go in and say, I really want to block IP reputation. We're not comfortable blocking rules that may cause problems on your network on your behalf. So you can go in and easily do that with the rule set now. But as far as our recommendations are our recommendations. Or emerging threats, if you'd rather use their recommendations, you can just create a rule that says, in all cases, use the recommended value. And then you'll be using the pure upstream recommendations, regardless of, say, your memory or so on. All right, Shannon, I think if you wanted to cover
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you guys can still ask questions. We still have people on hand to help answer questions. But just in case this is super confusing to you, we do offer some professional services that can help you with setting up IPS or your other network configurations. If you're installing us, converting us from a different vendor, or just want to do a checkup to make sure that everything in your network is running properly and that you're not missing any settings, we do offer those services. So take a look at those if that's something of interest to you. I think next slide, Dirk. Command Center, if you're not aware, Command Center is our cloud-based centralized management solution, and it is now included at no cost to all NG Firewall Complete packages. And then today we just recently announced our integration with Malwarebytes to provide endpoint visibility. So you can look on our website for more information about that. It's a pretty cool integration for those people that do utilize Malwarebytes. You can now see all those hosts in Command Center. And I believe that's it. Promotions. We have a few promotions going on, trade-in, trade-out programs. So if you have existing license that maybe, or appliance that is maybe outdated and you wish to kind of trade up that, reach out to your sales rep or sales@untangle.com and they can offer you some special pricing, as well as if you have a different vendor, if you're utilizing a different solution and you're looking to trade in that and move to Untangle, we will offer promotions for that as well. I believe we just have one more slide, just links to the wiki. Our wiki is our technical documentation as well as support, provides some pretty good use cases in terms of how to get things done. As always, you can contact us, sales@untangle.com, support@untangle.com. I know there were tons of questions today, so if we didn't get to them, or if you had a very specific question in regards to your network setup, please email us. We'll be happy to help you out. I believe that's it. Dirk, do you have anything else you wanted to cover?
No, I appreciate all the questions. Sorry, they were just pouring through, so we probably didn't get to all of them. But I appreciate everybody's time. If you did want to have more feedback or give us more feedback or ask more questions, we're always available on the forums, in addition to at support@untangle.com. So come on over to the forums. We'll be hanging out all day if you have more questions. And
All
thanks,
right.
everybody.
Thank you, Dirk, and thank everyone for joining us today, and have great holidays, everyone.